Kia ora and welcome back to the Royal New Zealand Yacht Squadron and day 4 of Vision Week. I'm Nadine Higgins and this week we're asking all Kiwis, what is your vision for the future of New Zealand? And has that vision changed since your experience of COVID and lockdown? Many of our inspiring speakers this week have told us that lockdown provided a rare opportunity to reset our vision for how we travel and connect, our sustainability. And today we're exploring the quality of life that we'd like to see for all New Zealanders in our cities and regions. And tomorrow, Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern joins us live. Vision Week is a not-for-profit event not affiliated to any one business, government entity or political party, and our findings will be made available to all Kiwis. So please share your ideas for New Zealand in a 20 to 30 second video and email it to us, content@visionweek.co.nz, or you can post it online, #VisionWeekNZ. Here are some of your ideas so far.
Ko te reo Māori, kia puta, kia hora, kia ora, i Aotearoa whānui. I'd like te reo Māori to be seen, shown, heard, sung, felt, in every space, everywhere, every place possible throughout Aotearoa. A lot of people took up the opportunity during lockdown to learn through vehicles like a Māori Fraser Day. Close to 28,000 people signed up, so people are ready for it. Kia ora.
The right to housing is with us. We don't have to justify it. Housing is a right. So how do we make that right real? How do we progressively realize this future where people have choice? A huge place that we need to start with urgency is around making sure that Māori have the opportunity to meet their own housing needs on their own terms. Sometimes that'll be on Māori land, so we need to fix how investment works on Māori land. Sometimes it will be in our cities in freehold properties. That's also part of the mix. We need to have all options on the table at all times.
My vision for public housing is that all Kainga order homes are built with universal design in mind, not just some, all of them. And this will speak to not just the disability population, but an aging population, homes that are culturally responsive, that are co-designed by the people who need them most.
At 11 today, here our panellists debate what quality living should be all about. And we'll answer your questions during a live interactive Q&A session to follow at 11:30. But let's start today's program by looking at one of our most basic needs for quality of life, a roof over our heads. Greg Ward spoke with economist and author Shamabeel Yacob about the state of our country's housing.
Will COVID-19 have any positive effect on the housing market?
Whether it's housing or anything else, the COVID-19 response gives us that license to invest in things that's going to be good for New Zealand. And I hope a lot of that sticks, because the state and our overall system has been absent in its caring to provide housing for the bottom quarter of New Zealanders. And yet we're there, that's where the crowding is, that's where the health effects are, and that's what we all pay for in terms of the bad health of these folk, but also the cost to the system in terms of health, welfare, and all those other things.
And in the past, you've identified a failure to build new homes as the number one problem. Does that remain the number one problem in housing?
Well, we don't build enough homes, and we don't build enough homes for poor folk. They are two related but slightly separate stories. We need to do a lot more because New Zealand is not very well housed. Our houses are not of good quality. So we've got this kind of ongoing issues in our housing system, but it reflects that underlying problem. What are we trying to achieve? If our regulation is not fit for purpose in creating healthy homes, there is something wrong with the values that drives us.
Having said that, a lot of people have made a lot of money out of selling houses to each other. What do we need to do in the future to make sure that the gap between the haves and the have-nots is closer, and that as a country we're all trying to work for the same cause?
I don't have a problem with people getting wealthy, but if it has a consequence of making other people worse off, there is something wrong. And in our housing boom of the last 10, 20 years, that has been the problem, is we've seen some people get very wealthy, But we've seen the consequences in terms of people living in overcrowded homes, people living in incredible financial stress, people not being able to get access to housing, even though we know that's absolutely important for retirement in New Zealand, because otherwise New Zealand super is not sufficient. So there's all these kind of problems that are wrapped up in each other that makes untangling it really hard. So from a policy perspective, we know what the technical fixes are. That's not the problem. The problem is the willingness of the politicians across the political spectrum to deal with it.
New Zealand's largest landlord is Kainga Ora, and Chief Executive Andrew Mackenzie picks up the housing discussion. As ambitious government construction projects resume, Andrew spoke with Greg Ward about social housing and quality living.
So, Andrew, what's the long-term vision about what the new look public or state housing will deliver to tenants in terms of health, safety, quality of life?
Whenever we're making decisions about our homes and where they are, the quality of home, we do take two key things into account. One of them is who is going to be living in that home. And to live in a public house, you've got issues around income, and often you come from quite a complex, difficult background. So we're trying to make sure our homes are in a place where it's easy for you to get the support you need. Also try to make sure that it's of a quality that enables you to live in there within your means. So being thermally efficient, cheap to heat, easy to live in, meeting your needs from particularly those people who have disability issues. We have a very deliberate plan now that at least 15% of our homes will be of the universal design standard. That means they're accessible. We're looking to beat that. That's a bottom line, if you like, for us. It's not actually the targets. We're going to be more than that. All of these things make the house a better home for people to live in.
First home buyers in the next couple of years, what will be your role supporting and helping first home buyers?
At the moment, we have the Kiwi product, which we make available for people who are first home buyers or second chances to get access to. We also work with developers on that land we own, so that when they buy the land off us, they do it with a development agreement that requires that they have a time period in which they need to build, and there are targets for affordable housing within it. So if you're buying a piece of land of us in Mangere, half of the homes that you build, for example, might have to be affordably priced, and that gives you the ability to buy that land off us ready to build on.
Let's imagine for a moment that you were in charge of setting a new course for New Zealand's future. What, Andrew, would be your priorities as we come out and enter recovery?
I think there's a way bigger question in there than what I'm responsible for. I think, just as the Chief Executive of Kainga Ora, when I look at what I'd like to see at a really fundamental level, working with other government agencies and understanding the impact they're trying to have on people's lives, particularly people who live in the homes that we provide. What I would really like to see as New Zealanders be way more accepting of the presence of public housing in their communities. These are people who we are supporting to participate and connect to the communities they live in. And too often there's fear around the presence of our homes and communities. Our customers are members of the community, they're not our customers. First and foremost, they are a part of our community, and we're trying to support them. And having communities that can accept them, embrace them, rather than push them away would be something I'd really, that to me would be a priority.
And given what we've all been through, now would seem the obvious time to do that. We've been standing in queues outside supermarkets, talking to strangers. We're getting used to this now, aren't we?
Yeah, too often there's a kind of a caricature image presented. A third of the people who live in our home are solo mothers. 40% of the people who live in our homes are children. They're New Zealand's future, as well as the current group of people needing the support of a public house. So embracing them and accepting them into communities, making them part of them rather than pushing them away whenever there's a development, is part of making sure that in the long term New Zealand has people who really feel as though they are part of New Zealand
At this very moment, you're sitting there at home running a very large organisation with thousands depending on you for their well-being. How are you feeling? Are you feeling apprehensive? Are you feeling relieved, excited, fearful for the future? How are you feeling today?
I've got to say, when we went to level 4 and we had over 1,000 houses that we were due to complete and make available for people to live in the next 3 months. And as an organisation, that we would have completed nearly 1,900 homes. 3 years ago, we were building 300 a year. And those people have put all that effort into getting us up to the point where we're organised so that kind of thing happens. They were pretty gutted. And coming back into level 3 and then 2, and the ability for us to ramp those programs back up again, that's pretty neat. I mean, there will be more quality homes available for people to live in. There'll be more land that's available for people to build homes on, as with our land development program. They're really exciting things to be able to do to make people's lives better. So for me, moving out of 4 and getting going again on those programs of work is really exciting.
As we saw yesterday, Tūhoi made New Zealand history when they created the country's first certified living building, Te Kuarawhare. Reporter Carly Hemopo speaks with CEO Kirsty Luke and Tūhoi leader Tamati Kruger about green credentials and how a building can impact how we feel.
Te Kuarawhare is net zero energy, it's net zero waste, it has limitations on the carbon dioxide we can create within the building, and it's net zero water. Those are the things often quoted. What we were looking for was net zero laziness, net zero jealousy, net zero of not caring about one another. Te Kuarawhare is a symbol of community, and for community, you don't get stuck in the price.
Now we go from Te Kuarawhare to eco-villages. Are these initiatives a response to New Zealand's housing crisis?
No. The eco-villages, as with the Kuarawhare, is about living up to what we preach and what we believe. It's practicing our traditions and our customs. It is all about being tūhoi and tūhoetana, about our commitment to mana motuhake. We owe so much to the land that has given freely without asking for anything back. And so this is what we have to do. This is not something that we think is by chance. It is a change that we have to make. So the greatest sermon is to practice what we believe.
Housing is about beauty, it's about hope, it's about generosity, it's about waking up in the morning and feeling good. That gives you the best chance of being the best mum and the best dad. Or we need to replace the very foundation that raises your spirit the moment you get out of bed. It gives us the best chance of community. One of the things about Te Kuarawhare is we're currently the largest photovoltaic setup in the country. And so how do we use that to power up communities and thereby create an affordable living standard? So we've got more time for each other.
Is Aotearoa New Zealand brave or even mature enough to think in this way?
I think we are. I think our population of 5 million allows us to dream and to see things within our lifetime. That is quite a privilege, you know. And living in a universe filled with wonderment, we cannot accept that the only thing we've managed so far is mediocrity. And so iwi are in a position to be able to provide Aotearoa New Zealand with a huge step forward in imagining a new world and a new society.
Unity drives action. I have seen it all of the time work that way. The powerful thing that COVID did was unify our needs and our wants at a global level in a way we have never experienced before. It didn't matter what sport you played, whether you were a vegan or a meat eater. Our wants were the same. Our wants were home, our wants were family, our wants were neighbours. When we are sharing life experiences in the same way, our actions become a lot more common sense. Our needs and our wants are aligned. And so COVID gave us that experience. We should take as much value as we can out of that.
The lockdown experience saw some heartwarming examples of people supporting each other in their communities. Sustainability engineer Kate Boylan discusses what it's taught us about building stronger and more resilient communities.
I think the lockdown has cemented the importance of our relationship with our community, right? You see the rise of the student volunteer armies and just people posting on Facebook like, hey, is there anyone in the local vicinity that I can help, or any elderly people without near family that I can help do the shopping with and go out and do the chores. I think that has been so inspiring and like warm, fuzzy feeling to kind of see, because it's just the community being what a community should be, you know. I think supportive of each other and understanding to others' needs. I think that's been incredible to see, and it comes back to kind of more of social housing models and being close with the people who you live around, you know, because the closer you are with those people, the safer you probably feel in your home and in your community, and the more likely you are to support each other, whether it be, you know, supporting each other's business or just keeping an eye out for each other. I think that's incredibly important and definitely a big social outcome of this.
Any sort of initiatives around social housing that you think could help us moving forward?
Social housing should be considered from the development stage, you know. I think we shouldn't be designing these houses and these precincts or these communities to be just, again, strangers living next to each other. Can we have more community areas where people can connect and build those friendships and that community feeling? I think it's something that needs to happen from the design level, and the Green Building Council is touching on that with some of their tools. And I think it's you know, the strength of community is such an untapped resource, and we could definitely build further on that.
You talked before about New Zealand being viewed on a world stage as being really clean and green. And I guess this sort of reset has given us an opportunity to really live up to that and push on from that even further.
This disruption provides the perfect opportunity for a sustainable reset, a green recovery, and to start really thinking about the environmental, social, and cultural outcomes that we can have. You know, we're going to have this big economic stimulus. We're going to spend money on infrastructure, and I think it's really important to have that lens on the outcomes that we can have other than economic through that. Again, listening to experts in the field, shovel ready would indicate that it's old ways of thinking, and it's the new ways of thinking that we need to be thinking about more. So maybe instead of brand new projects, more, you know, building on what we already have and making things better.
Quality living is more than just four walls. The way that our physical environment impacts on how we live, feel, engage with nature and connect with each other is equally important. Panuku's Corporate Social Responsibility Advisor Tessa Meyer discussed the connection between the built environment and resilience with Kale Hemopo.
The built environment, or the sort of urban fabric of our cities, is so important from an environmental resilience perspective. So looking at engineered solutions that help deal with flooding or severe storms or earthquakes, making sure that every community in New Zealand has good access to those things and has within walkable distance the amenities that they need to live a good life. And I think COVID-19 has perhaps shown us what serves us within our local bubbles. Do we have access to fresh food? Do we have access to a park? Do we feel safe to walk around by foot or to cycle? And on the other hand, which you pointed out, the social fabric of our communities is so, so important. And I really discovered how vital that was when I was in Canterbury. That's where I studied my master's in urban resilience and renewal. And I looked at the relationship between the built environment and community resilience. And it's sort of not always so much about what facilities or where communities are in the city, but about how they engage with one another and how much they're empowered to sort of lead their own community initiatives. And certainly in the CBD in Canterbury, it was those transitional community-led pop-up initiatives in every little nook of the city that made it really vibrant and brought people back into the city and stimulated the economy and small businesses and entrepreneurs. I think that civic engagement and public space and opportunities to connect with one another and support one another is so, so important. It's as important as the physical environments that we live in.
Do you think we have the innovation and commitment at the moment to respond adequately to these issues?
I think we're making some progress. So if I look at the recent budget, and let's say housing and infrastructure, on the Healthy Homes boost and the injection of support to expand that program from 40,000 homes to 46,000 homes. I think that's good. It's going to be great for those additional homes and families that will benefit from a warmer, drier home. But we know that there's 500,000 homes in New Zealand that aren't adequate. They're not well insulated. They're damp and moldy. And the flow-on effects of that is that we have families with more severe health issues, which then puts our health system under more pressure. They have the cost burden of higher energy bills. Their quality of life is reduced. And so I think we need to do more. It's a good signal, but we've got a long way to go.
Opportunity, environment and quality living for all New Zealanders has been something that Warehouse Group founder and philanthropist Sir Stephen Tindall has actively supported through his impact investments. Belinda Henley spoke to Sir Stephen about the Tindall Foundation approach to housing.
One of the things that we've noticed in terms of impact investment through the Tindall Foundation is that by doing things a little differently and creating products like joint ownership and rent to buy and that sort of thing, we've been able to create homogenous communities by building a variety of different homes all in the one area. Those kind of innovations, if there's demand for housing as there was, or at least more than we've got at the moment, we can use these things that we've learned.
One of the biggest challenges we're facing right now as a country is unemployment. What is your view on maybe how we can help those people who are finding themselves without work? I think
the one thing that is incredibly important is that people that are unemployed are not left to do nothing. The worst and most demeaning thing in life is not to have some sort of a job. Now, you may have a paid job as you've had, or now you might have a volunteer job that's paid, but you're doing something that you know is meaningful that's helping the country. So one of the things that I looked at a few years ago was that we worked out if we planted 200 million native trees in New Zealand, we would help actually bring our carbon emissions back down to pre-1990 levels. The big thing is getting those things planted, getting those trees in the ground. And so we've got the ability to propagate them, no problem. We just don't have the kind of army of people that you need to plant those trees. That's one example. But there'd be lots and lots of things that we could build in New Zealand from a community and volunteer type of basis. The volunteers would be the people that could afford not to have to be on a benefit. The others would be people that would be on some sort of benefit, a living benefit that enables them to eat and have a reasonable life, but they're doing things for the country.
Former science advisor to the Prime Minister, Professor Saifiti Gluckman, has warned of an escalating mental health crisis as the impact of the COVID-19 disruption turns into job losses and economic hardship. Saifiti is one of New Zealand's most accomplished and internationally recognised scientific minds and is also president-elect of the International Science Council. He spoke with Greg Ward about the need for New Zealand to take an holistic approach to issues of well-being.
People who already were struggling may be struggling more because of COVID and the economic downturn, the unemployment, etc., etc. Then on top of that, we've got a new group, people who had a job as a travel agent or a job as an airline pilot or their small business in which they invested everything, their restaurant or the other small business they were operating is now in deep trouble or may have closed already. Those people now face their mental well-being also being considerably disrupted. And it's not just them, it's their whānau, their family, their whole relationships. And it's how we stop that moving from being the understandable and expected frustrations, disappointments, anger, into something that becomes chronic stress and leads to severe mental disorder in the end. And we know a lot about that, but it's hard to do because it's actually about restoring a sense of empowerment to people. Part of that comes from the kinds of fiscal supports we're giving, but a lot of it's about community support. One of the things that's really impressed me in this pandemic has been how iwi have looked after their whānau and their people in a very collective way without waiting necessarily for the government, even though the iwi may have limited resources. And so I think the collective sense of community, of empowerment, reducing the depth of control that bureaucracies like to have over vulnerable people is important in maintaining well-being. Beyond that, we obviously need to think about how are we going to provide for the large number of people who will need some level of support over their emotional distress. 20% of people can be expected in any 1 year to have some disruption to their mental well-being. 3 to 5% of those will need serious support in one way or another. But we know those numbers will now be much elevated by virtue of COVID. We don't know how much more, but it might have even doubled. And so that there are a lot we need to do, but it needs to happen largely in the community. But it requires an holistic approach. I think if there's one thing I'd like to emphasize, Greg, we need a holistic approach to our future. It's no use putting the environment here, the economy here, social well-being here, education here, etc., etc. That's what the Sustainability Development Goals were all about, was integrating and saying we needed a proper holistic approach to thinking about our futures. We've not quite got there in New Zealand. Yes, we've used language like the Living Standards Framework and the Wellbeing Budget, and that's all operationally to be applauded. But I think strategically we're still not quite at the heart of thinking about how we holistically move forward.
Casualties of the COVID-19 restrictions are the thousands of migrant workers stranded in New Zealand with no work and no eligibility for government benefits. Queenstown Mayor Jim Bolt discussed the likelihood of an humanitarian crisis with Greg Ward.
You've had some pretty tough times in Queenstown with food parcels being shared around and even talk by you a few weeks ago of a possible humanitarian crisis. Hopefully that did not eventuate.
Look, I still think that's a possibility. So we've got somewhere in the region of 4,000 to 5,000 migrant workers in the district. Unlike Kiwis, they don't get supported by the state if they lose their jobs. Through the Civil Defence Emergency Funding money, we've paid out in the order of $1.5 million in support packages, primarily food vouchers, utility payments, etc., to these folk, just to keep them going. Now, with lockdown easing out, we're worried that some will start to get moved out of their houses because they haven't been paying their rent. But of greater concern, when the supplementary wage runs out, and it's been extended, but when it finally does run out, I think there's a lot of those people think they still have a job. They're going to find out they don't have a job. What happens then? I'm really concerned that we will end up with a large number of people in this district who don't have an income, in danger of losing a place to live, and I am talking to government about the sort of support that those folk will need.
Next up is our Quality Living New Zealand panel discussion. And don't forget to send in your questions to be answered during our live Q&A afterwards. You'll need to submit your questions on the Quality Living NZ Q&A forum on our website, visionweek.co.nz/forum. But now we cross to Greg Ward and our panellists.
Welcome now to the panel discussion on quality living. And joining us today live, we have Mark Fraser, who is Joint DCE Urban Development Delivery at Kainga Ora. Welcome along. We also have Alex Saifiti from Auckland Transport and INZ Emerging Talent Team. Welcome to you. And finally, joining us remotely today, we have Jon Grayson, CEO from Infracom. Gentlemen, welcome. We have two questions for each of you, starting with you perhaps, Jon, first. Jon, has lockdown changed the way you feel about what's important?
Greg, I think COVID-19 has exposed rather than caused weaknesses in our system. And they're things that we can now address. I mean, the so-called fast-tracking of approvals is an example. So there are opportunities actually coming out of COVID. But it's also given us cause to rethink what our future might look like. Will some of the new ways of working become permanent? And in that context, is broadband now a competitor to our transport system? Will demographic patterns change? So intensification versus the quarter-acre block. But we're now moving into a critically important phase, and that is recovery. And in the rush to get things done, we may simply lock in the status quo. And in some areas that might be okay. In others, though, where we need reform, we may be locking out the opportunity for reform for decades. So the key in this period is to turn risk into opportunity.
Alex, you must be thinking a great deal about your future right now. So has anything changed about what you believe is important for your future?
What's important to me is my family, my whānau. And I don't think COVID-19 has impacted that or changed that importance. What I see as changed as a result of COVID-19 is the way that we look at on a high level things that we need to address. So when I look to a future New Zealand, I look to one where there is equal opportunity for my children. I look to a future where there is warm housing for my children. And I look to a future which is sustainable. Climate change, if anything, is COVID-19 on steroids. It is the thing that will be the biggest impact, have the biggest impact to us as Kiwis. So I think if we don't address it now as a result of COVID-19, I don't think we will address it at any time in the future. So it's definitely something that's pivotal for my children's future.
And Mark, I suspect you agree with some of the comments you've just heard. What's important or what's changed for you about what's important?
Yeah, look, I agree with both panellists. I think I might reflect perhaps at a closer to home, more personal level. The way that I work has changed, and I think the way that we will work and my colleagues and the people that I work with, we are going to work differently from this point. The other thing that's come much more salient for me is the intersection between work and home, or work and family. And I think there'll be others out there that have had an exposure to that intersection they didn't have previously. That's going to change how they approach work going forward.
Well, as you know, this week is all about vision for the future. So let's turn once again to Jon and ask you, Jon, your vision for quality living in New Zealand. Can you tell us briefly what that might look like, a vision for the future of quality living?
Yes, Greg, and our Infracom's vision is infrastructure for a thriving New Zealand. So I'd like to see a thriving New Zealand, and that's much broader than economics. It's about building communities, not just houses to live in, but the right infrastructure can underpin that outcome. And so that is an infrastructure system that allows us to meet our national aspirations, an infrastructure system that allows New Zealanders to seize opportunities and realise their potential. And infrastructure is a catalyst for economic growth. And that's really important for a small trade-exposed country like New Zealand.
Alex, you've already mentioned your concern about your family. You want security for them in the future. If you did look big picture, what do you see as the vision for quality living in New Zealand? What's the big picture for you, and what should we be aiming for?
I think when I think of a future New Zealand, I think of one that is productive, sustainable and inclusive. In terms of productivity, I think New Zealand is a bit lackluster in that space. I think of a future where we're the envy of large multinational organisations, but we're also the home of sustainable and productive Kiwi businesses. I think of a future where we are world leaders in research and development. In terms of sustainability, I think of a carbon zero 2050. I think of a transport system that is completely decarbonised by 2050. And I think of a New Zealand which is a world leader in green technology and green jobs. And finally, in terms of inclusivity, I think of a New Zealand which thrives on its diversity and inclusion, where everyone has equal opportunity and access to education, healthcare and social wellbeing. So that's kind of my future for New Zealand.
Well, Mark, that's a pretty impressive list. Is there anything you would add to that in terms of your vision?
Oh, it is quite a list. Maybe if I could focus on my professional interest being housing. It's a key infrastructure, of course, and I would love to see a future where we, New Zealand, can supply housing as needed, as it meets market demand, and that our housing industry is no longer cyclical as it has been for many decades now. We also happen to have some of the most expensive housing in the world, and contrary to popular opinion, land price isn't the underlying cause of that, actually the cost of production. So I would love to see a future where we've started to address that. I mean, the good news is because it is so expensive, there has to be room for improvement.
Jon, Mark wants to address the housing crisis. What has COVID-19 done to our housing crisis? Has it worsened or improved matters?
I think the most important thing out of COVID is that we do reflect on, as I say, the flaws in the system that it has exposed. Housing is a critical component of our well-being, and housing affordability goes to the heart of well-being. And there's a ripple effect from affordable housing. The more people who can participate in the market takes pressure off social housing demand. And I think the key to affordability are responsive land markets. And I take Mark's point, it's not just about land, it's about the package that goes towards a finished house. So, do our systems appropriately incentivise the timely release of product to the market? That's got a lot to do with our consenting systems, but if we can provide the market with greater certainty about where and when supporting infrastructure will be provided, that too allows the market to plan and respond in a timely way. Greg, I was pleased to see that the Resources Management Review Panel has recommended that we have a number of regional spatial plans across the country, and we support that. It's a great basis for providing greater certainty around planning and delivering infrastructure to support housing development. Even better, if there were to be long-term funding arrangements and a delineation of responsibilities between central and local governments based around those plans. Now that's taking us towards the sort of city deals which we see in the UK and Australia.
Mark, you're the country's largest landlord. What are your numbers? How many extra houses do you need for New Zealand's homeless, and what progress is being made building them?
So in the budget announcement of only a few weeks ago, government announced a further 8,000 social and transitional homes to be produced over the next 4 to 5 years. That's in addition to the 6,400 homes that are in train for production at the moment from a previous budget. So for Kainga Ora, we are heading towards just over 2,000 houses per annum, and then shortly to 3,000 houses per annum over the next number of years to deliver on those numbers.
There was one interesting outcome. I understand that COVID-19 actually eliminated rough sleeping in Auckland. Is that your understanding as well, that they were moved into motels and somewhere was found for everyone who was rough sleeping, 1,400 people?
Yeah, there was a huge focus by government on housing the most vulnerable and including rough sleeping. So yes, as I understand, it was very successful. And there's a number of projects underway, even pre-COVID, dealing with homelessness. The City Mission has a project under construction here in Auckland right now, and government's focus and Kainga Ora's focus on the provision of transitional housing and further state housing is addressing that same issue.
Alex, you've seen the big numbers on our recovery. Massive amounts will be spent in New Zealand, and unfortunately future generations, including yours, will have to pay for it. Have you had a chance to get feedback from other young people about the direction they want us to take and what they expect in terms of wise investments, wise spending? Presumably housing is going to be up there, affordable housing.
Definitely. I think when I speak to my peers and other young people, the first thing that comes to mind is that decisions are being made for them, but often without them at the table. I think of a lot of activism. You would have seen the protests yesterday for Black Lives Matter. You would have seen the climate change protests that happened over last year. So I think the youth and young people have a voice, and I think that often it is forgotten, because obviously the decisions that we are making today will mainly impact us and our children. So it's definitely important that we have a decision-making ability, or at least a seat at the table.
Some of those decisions will be made by boomers. Will your generation trust those decisions?
That's a good question. I won't call out boomers, but what I will say is that what we need is a vision which is long-term, a strategy which isn't ticking off some boxes for this year. There needs to be a long-term view, and it needs to take into account future generations as well as us today.
Jon, I wouldn't dare call you a boomer, but you have had an interesting position in that you have started a 30-year review of infrastructure, a 30-year strategy, really. What can you tell us about the shape that that's likely to take? I think it needs to be delivered next year, does it, or is it 2022? The 30-year plan.
Yeah, Greg, it needs to be delivered by September next year. And the 30-year strategy will be about, it will have a series of reforms. And those reforms will go to the sort of changes we need to see in the system to make it more agile, to make it more able to cope with the sort of challenges that we talked about, whether that be climate change or technological change or demographic changes.
Are they going to be bold changes or bold reforms?
I would like to see the 30-year strategy produce some bold reforms or recommendations for bold reforms. Now, bold reforms, of course, are nothing if governments can't implement them, if they're too difficult to be implemented. So equally as important as making the case for the bold reforms will be providing governments over time with achievable pathways to those reforms.
And before we leave you on this topic, Jon, Alex mentioned a moment ago that he's looking forward 30 years, so he's going to be around when these reforms are all put to work. What can he look forward to in 30 years, do you think?
But I think the reforms we're talking about will be to make our system much more agile, to deal with the challenges, to make us a more competitive economy, to build better communities that go to the well-being of New Zealanders.
Alex, those of us who don't walk or cycle felt that our mobility was taken away overnight. In terms of transport, do you feel that reform is needed in terms of the transport systems we operate in New Zealand? Is that an area for reform?
I think it absolutely is. I think when we think about carbon neutral by 2050, we know that the transport system plays a pivotal part in that. And if anything, you would have seen over lockdown, there was almost no traffic. But as I actually caught the bus in today, there was nearly almost back to normal. So I think COVID-19 we really need to take it as an opportunity to rethink, and we need to think of a system which is, one, decarbonised, but also there needs to be a system which is well integrated with land use. So if we look at an example, Hobsonville Point, it's a fantastic development, but the majority of people there, and I take your point, are taking the car to the city. So we need to have options, and whether that looks like safe cycling routes or that looks like mass transit. I think there's a lot of opportunity there, and an opportunity that we shouldn't let go.
And that was my next question for you, Mark. How do we better integrate housing, work, transport and place-based strategies, just as Alex is suggesting? Do you have any solutions for that dilemma?
Well, I think we need to think about the delivery of housing as part of a system rather than one house at a time, which has been, to a very large extent, New Zealand's history of new housing development, and typically on the fringes too. So we've just pushed our cities further away, and we've tended to think about the house as being the entity that matters. And so I think that if we're going to do it in an integrated way, we have to look at a larger piece in one go, and think about the delivery of all the components of that geography that make it successful and make it a community.
Alex, during lockdown, some people who were living alone probably felt extremely isolated, cut off, and yet New Zealand has a very diverse range of cultures. Many of them have extended families as an important part of their focal point. Is there anything we can learn there about the fact that presumably people who had a bubble with a large extended family were probably coping much better than people who were isolated? Is that something we should bear in mind as we plan for the future?
I definitely think that it is something that we need to consider when shaping our cities, our future cities and streets and communities. When we think about COVID-19, we think about people that, like you say, have been isolated and they might not have a bubble, or they might be the only person in their bubble. But then you also think of families that have been able to come together. It's been an opportunity to reconnect, and that's something that a lot of people who are isolated don't have. So I think in terms of shaping our future communities, we need to think about planning for the future, say COVID 2.0, where isolation isn't a thing because we've shaped our spaces so that community comes to the forefront.
Mark, another one for you. What needs to change to enhance quality living from our natural resources?
We have been quite wasteful, and we've been disconnected in the way that our living styles, our housing production systems are from where all that material and that resource comes from. And the comment was made earlier about the way that our transmission system operates, our electricity transmission, and the changes that are coming there. I mean, there's heading towards a carbon 2050. We have got a long way to go from where we currently stand. It's completely doable. But that will force us to think about how we use those resources in a much more deliberate way.
Jon, interestingly, New Zealand doesn't apparently have a population growth policy. Is it time we had one, and what would it look like?
Good point. And we're in the midst of producing a 30-year strategy, right? And strategies are to achieve something. Now, what is the vision we're trying to achieve with this strategy? And population, both size and distribution, is a key part of that. So yes, I think it would be helpful if there was a population policy to help guide that. It's a policy, though, that I think needs to have broad consensus so we can all plan confidently towards that. It's a complex area, though. It's not as simple as saying lower immigration will relieve the stress on our infrastructure. We're an open, trade-exposed economy, and I can't imagine us succeeding without significant migration. And if migration continues at a high rate, we'll need to be prepared to invest in infrastructure to keep up or keep ahead. So we don't have a population policy at this point, and part of our 30-year strategy may be a recommendation that there needs to be a national conversation around that.
Alex, I want to hear more from you about the big issue that affects your generation, affordable housing. As a result of what's happened with COVID-19, do people your age, your peer group, do they believe they will be better placed to enter the market, or is it going to make things worse? How are they feeling right now about affordable housing?
When we talk about affordability, we obviously talking about the dynamics of supply and demand. And what we know is that there is a lot of demand, but not much supply. And I know that the likes of Kainga Ora are trying to build houses and try to improve that aspect. In terms of COVID-19 and whether that's impacted anything, obviously interest rates are lower, which is great for first home buyers. But there's still a lot that we need to address within the housing market. You might have seen the latest census data saying that 1 in 3 Māori in Pacifica are living in damp homes. And when you think about that, you think, well, one, they're living in damp homes, but if they're working from home, they're not going to be as productive as someone that has a warm, dry home. So there are a lot of opportunities and a lot of challenges, and it's something that will need to be addressed, and we are slowly addressing, but it's not going to be easy.
Mark, 1 in 3 living in damp homes, it's pretty depressing. Is it going to change quickly?
It's a big job to fix it, but there is a lot of activity in recent years and right now to address that, both in new housing supply. The standards of new housing have definitely moved up for the better. But the improvement of existing housing stock, there's the work that Kainga Ora are doing. There are other policy initiatives around the Healthy Homes Act, etc., that are starting to try and sort of proactively impact the way that existing houses perform. So I'm positive about the change that's underway and it's coming.
How do your new designs differ from, say, 30, 40 years ago? How will a family notice things are different in a modern design compared to, say, the 1970s?
We are much better these days at building our houses and orientating them in the right direction. That sounds pretty basic, but it's a relatively recent idea in New Zealand that you should point the house in the direction of the sun. So we are getting better at it, and I think we still build, because the cost of our housing is so high in New Zealand, we still struggle to build really high-performing houses. So they're much warmer than the 1970s, but if we compare it to Europe and North America, they would look at our housing, our good quality housing, and say it's not that efficient. So we've actually still got some way to go.
So John, there's a free tip for your 30-year strategy. North-facing housing brings benefits. Wrapping up now, do you have any closing statements regarding the future, especially with regard to the 30 years ahead of us, that 30-year strategy? What's your closing message today?
So, Greg, I think the thing is that we need to be conscious that the future is not the past. And our 30-year strategy, if it's to be successful, will really challenge established norms to build a system that can cope with disruption and the increased uncertainty we're seeing and take advantage of changing environment, technology and demographics. I think that's what will allow us to define our place in a very dynamic world. And look, Greg, the ideas are out there, and a big part of our role is going to be about capturing those great Kiwi ideas. And if there is more involvement from the sector, if there's more consensus around the strategy and its recommendations, the more powerful it will be, and the more influential it will be on decision makers across political cycles. So I really do encourage the sector to get involved, starting with Infracom sessions during Vision Week.
Alex, your generation will live with these decisions for years to come. What's your message to the decision makers about the importance of getting this right for future generations? A closing message.
We need to be looking a long-term view, and often what governments tend to do is look to please their voters. And it's something that we need to start thinking about, addressing some of these issues which we know are issues and which need to involve everyone in terms of making tangible change, things like climate change, housing affordability. To summarise in closing, it really needs to be those three things that I spoke about. It needs to be a productive, sustainable and inclusive New Zealand, and it needs to involve everyone in bringing that forward.
And Mark, a closing message from you. Are you confident that in the years ahead your teams can tackle these enormous challenges and build the sort of country that Alex and his peer group are desperately waiting for?
Yes, I am confident. Like I've talked a little bit today about some of the issues that we've got in our history of housing supply, but I'm really confident about the changes that are underway in how we build, how we deliver on affordable housing, how we deliver social, state and healthy housing. There is an extraordinary amount of work in that area now, more I think perhaps than ever, than maybe arguably the 1950s and 60s when the state housing program of that era got underway. I this morning came from a building site where 3 houses were going to be constructed on site in a day, having been done off site, and they were delivered on a truck this morning. So there are changes coming in our industry. So I'm really positive about it. It's a big job ahead, but we do know what the problems are, so it shouldn't be too impossible for us to start addressing them.
So many of us won't be able to imagine what living in cold, damp conditions looks like, but sadly a lot of people do know it. What impact do those conditions have on individuals, and how bad is the situation?
I think when we think about cold, damp homes, we think about, I think about a cycle, and a cycle of poverty. And it's something I don't think that we address enough, personally. We have about 1,600 people per annum dying because of the impacts of cold and damp homes. So it's something that needs to be addressed, and I think one way that we can look at addressing things is by ensuring that there's accessibility to those pivotal things like social housing, social services and healthcare. And a potential solution is ensuring, when I say accessibility, I'm talking about things like the 20-minute city. This is something that I believe Hamilton City Council is looking into. You've got the likes of Sydney and Paris are already doing, and that's around where you live and having accessibility within, say, 20 to 30 minutes walking and cycling to education, healthcare, leisure and work. Often we see in the outskirts that's where the damp homes are, and in terms of their transport and accessibility, it's potentially not as good as, say, looking in the city at the City Rail link, and very much everything is quite accessible. So to tackle that challenge, I think we need to start looking at addressing accessibility.
And Mark, this is something you're well aware of. We had a laugh before, admittedly, about north-facing homes, but the impact on families is quite severe.
It's incredibly severe, and I
I wanted to quote more health statistics, but we know that the impact is enormous. I think that in New Zealand, we've gotten so used to poor performing houses that many of us actually don't know what a warm house feels like. And if I can relate to a project I was involved in a few years ago where we were marketing and selling homes that we had required be built to a higher standard in terms of their thermal performance. And we were trying to convince buyers that this was a good thing. We're pointing out all these features. And the response from the buyer was, yeah, whatever. Like, I know I know it's double glazed. I know it'll be warm. They would move in, go through winter, and then the only thing they could talk about was how warm the house was. So their mental image of what a warm house was and what it really felt like was, whether they weren't the same. And I think that's right across the country for other than those lucky enough to be in a modern warm house.
And a final word from you, John, regarding being in a modern, warm building and looking after our health. We were lucky as a country, weren't we, that our hospitals weren't tested in terms of the numbers that were admitted. We would have struggled to cope.
Yeah, very lucky indeed. Well, perhaps it's not luck. I think our response to the COVID crisis may well have been designed with that in mind. That is the impact on the health system. So good planning, good outcome.
Good planning, good outcome. Thank you, and thank you all once again.
Kia ora everybody and welcome to Vision Week New Zealand, the third of our live Q&As. Today we're talking about quality living in Aotearoa. Joining us today is Andrew McKenzie, the CEO of Kainga Ora. We have Alex Saifiti from Auckland Transport, and joining us online, thank you technology, from Wellington is Jon Grayson, the CEO of the Infrastructure Commission. You're there, John.
Good morning.
Good morning. We're going to kick off, John, because you're not with us in person, with a question for you. Yesterday we had an inaugural survey of our hospitals showing that they need around $14 billion of investment just to bring them up to Ministry of Health and Australasian medical guidelines. Where did we go wrong and how can we make sure this doesn't happen again?
Yeah, good question, Belinda, and goes really to the heart of what we're about. And it's about getting the incentives in the system right. The problem is if there's a trade-off between $1 going into clinical services today and $1 going into maintenance, which is easily pushed out, the clinical services will win out. Now that is understandable, but it's not good for the long-term health of the system. So we need a system that's going to look at long-term whole-of-life commitments, not just planning over a budget cycle. Procurement models have a role to play here, where long-term asset management, maintenance is passed on to an external party. And that's one way of dealing with it. But we're really pleased that this data has appeared now. We will incorporate that into our infrastructure needs assessment to build a holistic picture of the state of our critical assets.
Because, John, we're obviously talking about quality living New Zealand here, and I guess having a robust health system really sits at the very core of that.
It does, and that's why we need to take the long-term perspective, which is why I talked about that sort of marginal dollar going into clinical services today or long-term maintenance. We do need to have an eye on that long-term health of the system, and that's what we're about.
Great, thank you, John. Andrew, to you now, we've got a question from Dr. Robbie Watene, talking about the concept of universal design for all Kainga Ora homes, making sure the homes are accessible to all. At the moment, this sits at around 15%. Do you think we need to see that increase?
Yeah, I think last year we worked through this issue with our board, and what we agreed was that we target at least 15% of our new build homes being fully accessible for people, so meeting the universal design standard. We've also done a lot of work with our customers understanding their needs, so not all disabled people need wheelchair access and things like that. The most common disabilities tend to be sight or hearing, and so part of it is making sure that our homes are suitable for those people. There are a couple of complexities. One is obviously when we're building and there's the economics around the size of homes, so particularly height. We are building a number of three-storey homes, and we don't have lifts in them, so the tops two stories automatically won't necessarily be accessible. But we obviously can make all the bottom story, the ground floor, accessible. But that is a minimum target.
I guess that's something too, Alex, that the transport sector must have to take into consideration, making sure that that accessibility across a variety of people is really a priority for you.
Absolutely, and I think that's something that has been touched upon in one of Auckland Transport's recent strategies, and that's around making sure that PT is accessible to those that are disabled. I think it's really important that we focus on that group of our community because they play a vital role, and it's something that we need to, I guess, action moving forward.
Okay, we've got another question for you here, Alex. How might Māori and Pacifica values be applied to a potential vision for quality living in Aotearoa?
I think when we think about Māori and Pacifica, central to Māori and Pacifica is the concept of community or whanaungatanga, which is understanding the relationships around you. And I think when I look at COVID-19, I've seen families that have come closer together, whether they're Māori, Pacifica or otherwise. And I think central to any vision is the importance of that value, which is whakawhanaungatanga. It's understanding your relationships with one another and making sure that there's collective decision making and anything that we look to assess in terms of a vision. Secondly, I think COVID-19 has brought up the concept of manaakitanga, and that's caring for people around you. It's also, we heard about buy local, buying Aotearoa, New Zealand first. Manaakitanga is about being kind, which is something that has been reinforced throughout COVID-19, and it's definitely something that we need to also apply into a future vision for Aotearoa.
John, back to you. A question from Ollie asking, do we have enough money in New Zealand for all the infrastructure needs that your 30-year strategy might ask for? Do we have the right settings in place to get what we need?
Well, I think the answer is yes, if we get the settings in the system right. So, you know, the 30-year strategy will be about mapping out a pathway, you know, for the next 30 years. And if that infrastructure is about improving the productivity of the country, the well-being of our citizens, then it is worth doing. What we have to be up for, though, is the sort of bold reforms that will get us there. And those bold reforms could go to industry structure and regulation, and it could go to how we finance that infrastructure need.
Okay, Andrew, coming back to you. I know you're passionate about lifting the quality of Kainga homes and I guess building them in the most sustainable way you can. Question here from Saul asking, what is the role for things like water tanks, solar panels, modular construction? Do we have the right building code settings to incentivise these?
Yeah, I mean, the building code actually is about building quality homes for people to live in and setting them up so that they do provide people with an assurance that they get into a quality place that's not going to fall down around them. And we've obviously had issues like leaky buildings, so making sure they're weather tight, they don't make you sick. When you move on to the next phase, which is about that additional level of functionality with broader outcomes in mind, where you're looking to improve not just the well-being of the people in the house, but the well-being of community more generally, the building code doesn't stop it. And certainly our experiences encourages it. There's a really interesting tie into the work that John's talking about in terms of the infrastructure needs. And we're certainly looking at a lot of models, particularly coming out of Australia, where homes are more self-sufficient. You reduce the burden on the network of infrastructure because you have a home that's able to look after some of the issues it's creating for the environment itself.
And I guess maybe this is a flow-on question for you, John. I mean, creating warmer, better quality, more sustainable homes is going to have a flow-on effect right throughout the system.
Yes, it does. I mean, our focus will be, of course, on providing the infrastructure system that will support the sort of housing outcomes that we need. So it has an important role to play in making housing more affordable, for example, which opens up some space for greater or improved quality. The other, just following on something that Andrew said, I think we need to think about the different role that houses will play in the future as well. So we have traditionally thought of them as shelter, and you know, we provide services to those houses. But in fact, in the future, houses may well be producers in the system, and I'm thinking of generating electricity and storing and feeding it back into the system. So that has flow-on effects for our electricity system, for example, playing a very different role rather than a one-way flow of electrons, enabling the trading of electrons between houses, generators, other producers.
That's a really interesting point. Alex, this kind of leads on from something you were saying earlier. Peter Gluckman has been talking about how impressed he was with how Māori and Pacifica groups really stepped up in helping the most vulnerable with housing and mental health support during COVID-19. How might we accelerate this approach and I guess ensure that it continues beyond sort of lockdown?
I would definitely agree with that. I've been following my own iwi Ngāi Tahu in the South Island throughout COVID-19, and there has been a lot of collective decision making, a lot of action, regardless of, I guess, central government. And I think that's something that we can, I guess, contribute or attribute to all communities. I think collective community decision making, one where it's nimble and fast paced and it flexible is something that we can definitely apply to any situation and not necessarily just iwi.
Okay, Andrew, a question from Scott Fegan calling for greater community housing participation, and also from Rupert asking about not-for-profit cooperative housing as we see in Europe. What are your thoughts on this, and do you think this could help turbocharge development?
Yeah, I think Scott's about community housing providers and the role they play in the sector, particularly the public housing provision, but also affordable housing products. So the Ministry for Housing and Urban Development, who are responsible for the policy settings that we work within, they're actually developing that kind of progressive housing ownership, different housing models, which will make housing more affordable and accessible for different parts of society. There's a lot of work being done on that. The government's already done quite a bit of work in terms of Māori and Pacifica support as well. There's quite a lot of stuff in the budget around supporting different ways of Māori and Pacifica accessing housing. From our perspective, we're working with community housing providers now. Our board meets regularly with the different governance members across the sector, and we're trying to work out how exactly the sector operates. The community housing providers have been growing in size and responsibility. The government's already said of the additional 8,000 homes that they have announced in the budget for the next 4 years, they're looking at what level of provision they'll get out of the community housing sector, and that's a conversation that the ministry will be leading.
Great. John, back to you. Question from Cliff asking, can we use the Reserve Bank to fund the building of state houses like we did in the 1930s?
Belinda, that...
Can you cast your mind back?
Belinda, unfortunately I can't draw on experience from that, but it does seem, I'd have to say, like a simplistic solution. So I think our focus will be, rather than on quick fixes or what might appear to be a good solution on the surface, is about getting sustainable solutions, and that generally means getting the system, the settings in the system right. So that will be our focus. Our focus will be on outcomes. So the human experience is at the heart of our strategy. It's got to be. And a focus on outcomes, not projects. And if you focus on outcomes, then you do open your minds to a lot more solutions, not all built solutions.
I'm seeing lots of nodding heads here. I think they agree with you there, John. Alex, yesterday we spoke to NZTA, and they were talking about a concept we've heard quite a lot of recently, which is, your role isn't just necessarily moving people around, it's about connecting people. What do you see as AT's role in sort of improving our quality of life? And I guess what learnings have come out of our lockdown period?
Well, I actually I was fortunate to listen to that interview yesterday, and it's awesome to see that NZTA is placing a focus on connecting people and connecting communities, because Auckland Transport also has a very similar purpose, and that's creating easy journeys. And we do that by connecting people and communities. I think it's really important, and we've seen it throughout COVID-19 in the lockdown, the importance of active transport and sustainable transport, whether it's walking and cycling as well as public transport. So I think we need to understand that cars are obviously very important. They play an important part in the whole, I guess, transport system, but they're not the be-all and end-all. And we need to start focusing or shifting our mindset in terms of placing more emphasis on safe and sustainable ways of travel. And I think that's something that we need to continue to invest in moving forward.
It strikes me that even though COVID-19 sort of forced this reset in the transport sector that nobody could have anticipated, perhaps some of those were goals that the sector was moving towards or needed to move towards, anything like more sustainable methods of transport, walking and cycling.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to say that it's definitely a goal and it is a vision, but I think often what happens is when times get tough, the things that we think is a priority aren't necessarily the things that are prioritised. And I think health and safety is a very key priority, but also sustainability. So our transport system needs to be fit for purpose and it needs to be fit for future. And I'm hoping that those above me are considering that in their decision making.
Great. Andrew, for some of your clients, Kainga Ora is the face of several government departments for those needing help and support. Kate is asking how you can help create and more holistically revitalise communities.
Yeah, I mean, we've changed our approach to how we work with our customers. In the last 3 years, we've kind of moved from a transactional view where people lived in our homes and we provided the home and a safe home for them, to one in which we want to understand and build a relationship with our customers so we understand the support they need to have lives where they've got dignity, stability, connection to the communities they live in. And a big part of that is understanding how they work with other parts of government and supporting them in getting access to those services. There's some other parts of government do this. The Te Puni Kaukari with their Whanau Ora program, for example, they are helping people in our homes too. We work with them to connect in with the rest of government.
Jon, another holistic question for you this time. The government's wellbeing framework seems to offer a more holistic view of how we approach housing, including environmental, cultural and social components, not just economic. Have we embedded wellbeing into the quality of living for Kiwis yet?
Well, Belinda, I think we need to, and this is a great starting point. This Vision Week is a great starting point about the sort of New Zealand we want to see in the future, and that will be a focus for our strategy. Our strategy will only have value if it can support the sort of New Zealand we want to see in 30 years' time. So I'm really pleased to see this conversation started because a strategy needs something to target.
Yeah. Andrew, back to you. Talking about the Urban Development Bill, and when that is passed, you're going to have powers to raise targeted rates, build infrastructure, issue resource and building consents, and do things that we're probably more used to councils doing. How do you think this might result in more quality housing being built?
Yeah, so some of those things we can do already. Obviously the rating and some of the land zoning or designation things are new. From our perspective, what that's going to do is put a great onus on us to get closer to the communities we're wanting to support. It's not about coming in and telling communities how things should happen. You have councils there who already spend a lot of time trying to understand the needs and aspirations of their communities. We can potentially add some speed and a complete picture where you have the zoning and be able to put the infrastructure in place and break down barriers where that might occur. But from our perspective anyway, these opportunities we have are really about connecting with those communities, the people already operating in them, and working out how we help them rather than stepping in for them.
Will it enable you to work sort of more efficiently?
Well, there's obviously a speed issue, which a lot of organisations, including government, have called out, and that's one of the things they're wanting to have happen. So speed, and that may definitely be something we can bring into the process.
Alex, you're part of Infrastructure New Zealand's Emerging Talents Network, and one of the purposes of Vision Week New Zealand is to talk more broadly across a variety of sectors about our vision for New Zealand and what's to come. But from your point of view, what does the sort of next generation think is important when it comes to quality living?
I think before answering that, I need to say that I don't represent all young people.
Good disclaimer.
Good disclaimer, yes. But what I think, in terms of my values and vision, I think something that a lot of young people would agree with is making sure that we have a future New Zealand, a future New Zealand that starts today in terms of our decision making. And what I mean by that is we need to start tackling these ongoing issues. We know we've got issues of homelessness, of poverty, of climate change, These are all big, hairy, audacious, I guess, issues. And it's something that we need to start tackling today, and I think a lot of young people would agree, because if we don't tackle it today, then our children and our children after us will be thinking, what were you doing?
And how important do you think it is that this generation steps up and takes ownership of some of those long-term goals?
I think it's really important, and I think we've seen a lot of what can happen with things like social media and activism. There's definitely a voice, and it needs to be at the table in terms of decision making.
Right, John, question for you. Infracom Infrastructure Commission, I should say, has to create a 30-year infrastructure strategy for New Zealand by the end of next year. Ngāi is asking, what vision will this strategy respond to, and how can you get a broad range of people participating?
Yeah, great. And look, the vision is something that we can't create. The vision has to be owned by New Zealanders. And I think that's within our grasp. I think the great thing about New Zealand, we're of a size where, you know, there's a Team New Zealand mentality, and I think that, you know, we could get towards a consensus view of a vision. So our infrastructure strategy is about supporting that vision, which is why this week is so important. So our 30-year strategy will, I think, in the first instance, be about cleaning up the shop. I like some of the things that Alex was saying about agility, and I think the first step, our first 30-year strategy, is likely to go to recommendations about how we can make the system more agile, more responsive to the sort of changes coming down the road at us, technology, climate, demographics, etc. But it really has to have well-being at its heart. And so that means taking a more holistic view. So instead of just looking at a sector, so a good example would be, say, corrections and justice. You know, it's not just about focusing on building more prisons. In another jurisdiction, the Chief Justice, when asked, you know, what sort of infrastructure did he need to support the justice system, he said more green space, please. That will reduce demand on the justice system. So it's about taking that holistic view. I think, though, that we do have to be up for bold reforms. And as I said before, we will complement that with achievable paths to those bold reforms, but it will be much, much more powerful if we have the sector, in fact, the broader New Zealand community, behind those reforms. So as we develop the 30-year strategy, we won't be doing that in a vacuum. We will be getting out there. There will be regional workshops. There will be focus groups, which in fact we'll talk about tomorrow. But the idea is to capture the ideas that are already out there in the New Zealand community and will help shape our 30-year strategy.
Well, that's a bold call to action and an exciting place for us to finish this conversation. Thank you so much, John, for joining us in Wellington, and thank you to Andrew and Alex for joining us here. And thank you to everybody for your feedback and your questions. Keep them coming. We have another live Q&A tomorrow, and that's all from us here at Vision Week New Zealand.
Thank you for your questions, and thanks to Belinda Henley and our panellists. Tomorrow, an important message for the nation. Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern joins us live. And we'll be joined by Andrew Grant in our studio to discuss key findings from the week and take some of your questions live. If you'd like to share insights from your local or regional Vision Week event, or perhaps ask Andrew a question on something you've heard this week, please submit your comment on our visionweek.co.nz forum and select Andrew Grant Q&A. I'll join you again at 10:30 tomorrow, but in the meantime, here are some moments from tomorrow's program. Ngā mihi nui.
Having a diverse set of ideas, having a diverse workforce, a diverse board, diverse management, all of those things are unquestionably better for your business.
The government superannuation is setting us up for intergenerational warfare because the current system is unsustainable.
Look, if you think of the capital markets and what drives them, right now we're looking at the new economic parameters that we're emerging.
We are going to a period of great uncertainty, risk, in which New Zealand's leadership, moral leadership, will be important.
One thing we've learned from COVID is that food is at the top of the list. You know, all we've spent money on for 7 weeks is food. So New Zealand, we tend to think of our agricultural, our farmers, as kind of being the past part of our business, and that, you know, companies like ours, technology companies, we're the future. Well, actually, this was a big warning for us, or big light for us. Food was really, really important, and we are really, really good at it.
You know, if we take that attitude in New Zealand, have the big audacious goal of how we can get there, but do it the Kiwi way.